Good evening, everyone. Welcome to #GotMoney. I'm Elizabeth Jackson. So we're kind of settling into this new way of living, and it's interesting for all of us. And there are a lot of questions about what it's going to look like for Australia economically. Now, I had Nicki Hutley, who is a partner at Deloitte's, come on the show maybe about a month ago. Nicki, we had a first initial conversation. And I've invited Nicki to come back in and join us because it's essential that we as Australians understand what this environment's going to look like. Nicki, welcome to #GotMoney.
Thank you very much.
So let's kick it off. The IMF have suggested Australia will be one of the worst hit economies in Asia. It's a pretty dark forecast, Nicki. Do you agree with them?
Yeah, we're probably a little bit more optimistic about what 2020 looks like, but this is just at the margins. It still doesn't look great, but we're probably more pessimistic about the bounce back. So the IMF is basically, if you look at their list of countries, there are almost every country has a minus in front of it. The worst is something like -7% fall in GDP. We're down, not far below that, probably closer to the -6. It doesn't look great. China is probably one of the few that gets away with having a very small positive, 1%. But then they have this big bounce back in 2021. And typically that's what we have seen in past recoveries. But this time things are very different. None of the economic rules apply because, as I mentioned last time, this is first and foremost a health crisis. And so we have to deal with the health strategies and some of those ongoing effects. And I'll give you one example. So Australia's been absolutely brilliant at, not just flattening the curve, but squashing the curve. Australians are most of us are doing the right things. A few people at some of Sydney's beaches who haven't quite got the message, but apart from putting them aside, we're doing really well. So, but even if, we're already starting to see some very light easing of restrictions, but even if those we get away with those and we go, okay, that's all right, and we take a little bit more, if you think about our national borders, those restrictions there, those barriers are not going to be lifted for quite a long time because we have to be confident that the rest of the world isn't going to bring something into the country, which has really essentially been where all the infections, of course, have come from. So some sectors of the economy will be fine and that will get better. But, that idea that we'll just sort of bounce strongly back and be back where we started in 12 months' time is probably a little bit optimistic.
So you talked about the borders. And I was looking at some information about that today. We've had 300,000 temporary visa holders have left Australia since January, and it's predicted we'll lose about another 240,000 migrants as a result of COVID. How does that impact on our economy?
It has a huge impact, whether it's temporary migrants or the sort of freezing up of new permanent migrants coming to this country. They have a massive impact on economic growth. We economists have this thing called the 3 Ps theory of growth, and it's about the growth is driven by your population, the productivity, and the participation. So how fast is our population growing? How many more people are we adding to the workforce every year? And then how much more productive are they? If you think about the first of those Ps, population, a lot of that in Australia, around half of that, is driven by net overseas migration. It's very important. So it is critical to our growth story, but it's also critical to the skills that we have, to, supporting our university sectors from a cultural perspective. And there are lots of different dimensions to the migration factor. And of course, in the housing sector, we'll feel it quite strongly because if we take away a whole load of demand, that's going to have blow-on effects.
I was worried about that. Because that's my sector.
Yeah.
So can you unpack that a little bit more? Are we going to see the market slow dramatically And is there anything that we can do to save the market? Do we open
Yes
up
and
those
yes.
gates? Do we reopen those gates quicker than predicted? How do we get through this?
I think we need to be very, very careful about when we do lift those final restrictions. But I think right now what we're looking at is, I guess, for the housing sector, that we just literally had this morning the housing prices from CoreLogic out for April, and they were actually marginally up 0.2% in the month, which is a little bit of a surprise. Certainly to me, but of course no one expects that to stay that way. If unemployment's rising and incomes are rising and falling rather, and we've seen that from the Bureau of Statistics, their new survey data that they've had out, then obviously the demand for housing is going to, for existing housing and new housing is going to slow. If we have the population growth slowing, then demand for new housing starts is going to slow, and that will feed through. The construction sector has already been hit, and they are very worried about what things look like, particularly when the current pipeline dries up around August, September. What can we do about that? I mean, I guess the first thing to say is if you're a first home buyer looking to get into the market and you're confident your job's going to stay, you're probably not that unhappy that affordability is going to look better.
I knew Nicki would have a good spin for us. Thank you, Nicki.
But I also know that state and federal governments are looking at lots of different policy options at the moment as to how they might support the market, particularly on the construction side. Can they give some funding support, for example, to social community housing? They might invest in a bit more maintenance of existing projects. Do they do something around like cladding, refurbishment? What sort of grants might come into the system? So there's lots of ideas that are being floated around different parliament houses around Australia, and governments are looking at what's the best cost benefit sort of outcome for them.
We had our first taste of a global financial crisis. Rudd and Julia Gillard gave us a Nationbuilding or Nationbuilding program. Is that on the table? Is there a recovery program like that could be considered during this time?
So the federal government, right at the start, in their first package, I think people have forgotten a lot about this, they announced a $1 billion recovery fund, and that was for longer term projects like regional infrastructure. And they've asked areas that have been hardest hit, particularly regional areas that have suffered from bushfires and then got the double whammy from the international tourism hit. They've asked them to have a look at what sort of things they might do. The New South Wales government has already announced fast tracking of some infrastructure projects, as well as fast tracking of maintenance of infrastructure, particularly social infrastructure. So yes, we definitely have some nation building. I think this government, though, as you'd be aware, has been very critical in the past of some of the Rudd initiatives. Not entirely fairly, as I don't think, but
I think he did okay, actually. I think Ruddy did all right, actually.
I think he did very well, and I think that's the thing that this government's now learning is when you have to respond very, very quickly to a crisis, you're not going to get everything perfectly right. But that doesn't matter. The important thing is to get money into the community to cushion the blow. But, obviously things like the building the schools revolution, that's not going to happen again. And so we'll need to sort of see, will governments think about where will they target that additional spending? And they certainly will get requests from specific sectors. Obviously tourism, we've already seen Virgin, putting their hands out and saying, well, what about us? Government saying, well, actually, we're not ready to step in and support you yet. So, look, there's going to be more of these, and we're going to have some interesting conversations as a country about what we do and what we don't support. But I expect the longer the restrictions stay in place, the more of these types of support initiatives we'll need to have.
Do you think they're loosening those restrictions now because they want the economy to start its place back into recovery? Do you think that's the objective?
I think it's twofold, actually. I mean, clearly the economics, everybody is saying, how can we, do something to minimise and mitigate some of the terrible economic impacts we're seeing. But I think also, and the Prime Minister's been clear on this, they are very concerned about the mental health and wellbeing impacts of this crisis. And I think that, particularly in New South Wales with the, you can go and visit, two people can go and visit somebody. So for me, best Mother's Day present ever, because my kids don't live at home, and there must be lots of people around the country in the same position. We've been trying to do the right thing. And so what a treat to actually be able to see them. But they now kind of feel as though they know where the spots are, and they feel they know where the contagion is. So they feel they can open things up a little bit without a big risk. We'll obviously see after this weekend, obviously not just New South Wales, but the other states, some of the other states as well. So it's that double thing of, yes, we need to do something about the economy. We also need to, get kids back to school, because it's much better for them, and there will be long-term impacts if we can't do that soon. But also that mental health and wellbeing picture is important.
Yeah, I think that's massive. I have to agree with that. They're starting to suggest that our unemployment stats are going to be really high here in Australia, that we're going to have less jobs. But if we've got less migrants, doesn't that change the balance slightly there? Isn't that actually a good thing? I mean, I don't want to be unkind about not having these migrants in Australia. I want them here, but isn't that like a fine balancing act too, Nicki?
Yeah, and so, there's an expression, lies, damn lies, and statistics. So you need to be very cautious always in how you interpret statistics. And unemployment represents the number of people who are looking for a job as a percent of the total labour force. And the labour force is made up of those who are in work and those who are looking for work. So if you take 300,000 people out of the workforce, out of the labour force, and they're no longer looking for work because they've left the country, then arguably, then that feeds through into actually a lower unemployment rate rather than a higher unemployment rate. So yes, it does make the numbers look better. And obviously, those people were not eligible for government support. So it makes sense for them, if they can, to go away. But I mean, there are longer term costs when we want to start the economy up again and get, skilled migrants back into the country. It takes time to do all of these things. As long as it takes to hire new people from a domestic perspective, it takes even longer to get those migrant workers back in. So, it's not necessarily a bad thing right now, but it's going to create us a few headaches, as the economy picks up.
What other employment markets are emerging as a consequence of this? I know that we're seeing more people going into the medical sector, but are you noticing anything where I think somebody had just finished as a flight attendant, and now they were working at Coles, and obviously there's good employment in that sector. Are there any other sectors that are emerging as a result of this that otherwise we would have overlooked?
Not really. I think they're the really obvious ones, which is around food, and obviously around transport and the delivery sector. Call centres have burgeoned in all sorts of places, not just the governments, obviously, from their helplines, but even things like the banking sector, hiring more people. But if you sort of look at the surveying that the Bureau of Statistics has done, it looks very much like, there's some jobs being created, but for every job, where there's maybe a few hundred or a few thousand here, there's just 100,000 over here that have gone. So it's very much at the margins. But yes, look, it's, there are some signs of, out there that there are some opportunities. It's not 100% doom and gloom.
Reserve Bank have purchased. The Reserve Bank has purchased $36 billion of government bonds. So do we, Australia, or the government, owe the Reserve Bank with $36 billion? How does that work?
Well, no, it's actually the other way around. So if you think about it, the government issues bonds is their way of issuing an IOU and saying, we need to borrow some money to pay for all this additional expenditure that we're doing. So we will issue a bond, and you and me as investors, if you've got superannuation, you will be an investor in the bond market. We purchase those bonds and we say, great, this is a good investment. It'll pay me some interest. I'll get my money back at the end of it. What's happening now, though, is to increase the amount of money that's in the market, the Reserve Bank is saying to the banks who are big holders of bonds, the banks have to have a stock of assets there. It's called their capital adequacy ratio. And what it says is they have to hold, against all the money that they borrow out, they have to hold a certain percentage ready to access in case they need it. So it's ready liquidity for those banks. It's a lower return for them, so they don't want to do a lot of it, but they have to do it. And some of it's cash, and quite a lot of it is held in government bonds because they're readily tradable. So what the Reserve Bank is doing is saying, right, banks, to help you have more liquidity and more credit, we will buy those bonds off you and give you more cash, and that will put more cash into the system so that we saw credit numbers for last month came out this week, jumped up by 3% in the month. You know, they had been falling and falling and falling for months, for years, across most, you know, both business and household. That suddenly jumped up because obviously everybody's looking for, well, how do I get by? So people are putting more money on their credit card. Businesses are having to get even a temporary loan until they can perhaps get the JobKeeper payments. So that credit just went jumping through the roof. So to help the banks be able to fund that credit, they've been given some cash. So those bonds are an IOU from the government. So the government, which is basically us, the taxpayers, owes that money essentially to the Reserve Bank. So whoever holds those bonds is the person that is, you know, has the IOU, if you like.
So isn't the Australian government the Reserve Bank? So aren't they kind of unpack that a little bit for me? So
ultimately, yes, they are. I mean,
okay.
the Reserve Bank is the government's bank, but they have an independent board that implements monetary policy. But ultimately, you know, that they are responsible to the government. Any profits that they earn in the course of a year through, for example, currency trading, that goes into the government's coffers at the end of the year.
Okay. So the other question I have for you is, so essentially we're printing money, right? If we're printing money, aren't we hyperinflating our money? What happens to our currency inside of this?
So we're not technically printing money. We're not even digitally printing it per se. Because there is at the end of the day, there is a guarantee of this being paid back because it's backed by a government bond.
Okay.
It's not the government just printing more money into the economy. In some places that is the case, and there are some people out there who are saying we should just do that because it doesn't matter. But you are absolutely right. It's something that's called modern monetary theory, and I call it modern magical thinking. Because you can't just print money. We have seen time and time again. Let's look at Argentina, look at Germany in the 1930s. You know, if you keep printing more and more money, the price goes up, inflation goes up. You know, its worth goes down and the cost of living goes up. So it just
it's counterintuitive, isn't it? It's a broken plan, isn't it? So the other thing that's happening right now, it kind of feels like we're engaging in a little bit of a dispute with China. What does that do to us? I mean, I feel really vulnerable as a citizen. Well, I'm a permanent resident, but as someone that's here in Australia, what does that do to our economy if we're engaged in bad feelings towards one of our biggest purchasers?
This is a really interesting and important question, Elizabeth, really interesting and important. China is obviously our biggest trading partner, incredibly important to Australia across all sorts of fields, particularly resources, but also in the services export sector. Think about all the number of students that have come here. And of course, you know, you heard a week or so ago, the foreign minister, saying we're going to have an inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus and thinking about Wuhan. And immediately the Chinese ambassador here saying, well, if you want to think about that, you know, we didn't start it. And in actual fact, if you want to do that, we're going to have stop beef sales, stop wine sales, stop our students coming. So already upping the ante on this. It's always been an issue for Australia. You saw how difficult things got between the US and China over the last year or so with their trade negotiations.
Is that what we're calling them? Trade negotiations?
Well,
we're calling them wars. Negotiations.
Trade wars. And which flows on to the rest of the world. So Australia has to walk a very fine line between making sure that we stand up for what is right, but also guarding our economic interests. And this is, this is why we have a foreign affairs department, led by very capable diplomats who try and walk that fine line. But if we just came out and said what we really thought about China, it would be problematic for us.
It'd be horribly problematic, wouldn't it?
Walk this fine line. We actually can't afford to be too strong. We need to work. And look, we can work on these things through numbers of channels, through, the students that we send over to China, for interactions with Chinese students who come here, business to business relationships, as well as that government to government relationship. There are lots of ways that we could be influencers and be getting our message across without going in with heavy boots and a fist. We can be diplomatic about how we handle these conversations, and we absolutely need to be, because we are beholden to China for our trade. Also said, though, China trades with Australia not because it's being nice, but because it is good for it to do so. We produce the best grade iron ore, coking coal in the world. We produce the finest wines at the best value prices. Our agricultural produce is, it's much closer and easier for it to come from Australia than most other parts of the world. So, it's not just they're doing us a big favour. There's something in it for both of us. So we need to remember that too.
Well, exactly right. I mean, and look, India is becoming this incredibly large emerging buyer of our goods as well. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to give consideration to other marketplaces that we wouldn't otherwise enter into, or that we've.
Well, I think India will benefit from some of the argy-bargy that's going on, particularly when you think about the US and its stance on China. You might see some shifting of relationships out of India, which is still growing strongly, and probably will fare a little better than other countries. Certainly the IMF forecasts are a little bit more optimistic. So could be their opportunity.
What are your thoughts about the mining magnate showing up with a member of their Chinese political party to that press conference recently? I think it was a couple of days ago. He kind of got himself into some hot water there, didn't he?
I think people should stick to doing what they do best and leave the diplomacy to the diplomats. But it's you've got to be so careful, don't you?
Oh God, are you still optimistic? Last time I spoke to you, you were really optimistic about our ability to recover from this. Do you still feel that way?
Yeah, look, I think like most people, I go in waves. You have good days and you have bad days. I don't underestimate the severity or duration of the economic challenge that we face. This is not I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's not going to be an easy path out. But I also keep looking for the good in this, for the positives that will come out of it. And, if you're sitting out there listening to this and you've lost your job and, you're wondering how you're paying the rent and you're going, what does she know? And, how can she tell it's going to be good? I'm not, negating anything that people are feeling now or going through now. There are a lot of people doing it so tough, and my heart goes out to these people. But I do think that we will learn some lessons from this. I'm encouraged that the Prime Minister has said we can't go back to business as usual. We need to do things more efficiently. Let's see exactly what that means. There are good ways to be more efficient and less good ways to be more efficient. But I think as a society, I hope that we will value the social and the environmental aspects of what we do when we do engage in the economy far more than we have. I was talking to my brother and his family on the weekend. We set up a Zoom call. His eldest daughter has just had a baby not long ago, and we had this fantastic. My kids were all on Zoom together, and we had this beautiful interaction. And I thought, why on earth has it taken a bloody crisis like this for us to do something?
Yeah, you're
But
creating connection.
irrespective, those sorts of things, I think, I hope that people will value those connections long after we are out of restrictions. I do think that, I do believe, I've seen us go through so many crises, and I do believe governments, international organisations, monetary authorities, they are there when we need them. And I believe that people are immensely adaptable and courageous, and it's painful, but yes, we will get to the other side of this, and there will be some things, in fact, that are better as a result of it. No one would choose this, but, you've got to hold onto those silver linings. It's very cliched, but boy, that's the way you can get up and out of bed in the morning and keep a smile on your face. And don't forget your sense of humour.
Exactly right. I like that about you, Nicki. You were like that last time I interviewed you. You just went, you know what, we're just going to be better as a consequence of this. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for
My absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel pretty good about what's going on myself. I feel pretty good about, you see, I know, I understand your placement around the housing market, which is always my sector, but, I've got the developers ringing me saying, tell your clients I'll pay the deposit to get them in the property. Now that never happens. We never have a climate of this kind of generosity. And look, I know their generosity is spurred by desperation because they want to sell their product. But there's never been a climate inside the Australian property market like this where we can actually elevate those into home ownership that otherwise wouldn't get that as an opportunity. So I'm kind of seeing these good things. And it's nice to drive down the road and not get stuck in traffic. And and you're right, I spend more time now with my friends and family on Zoom than I have ever done before. So I'm like you, I'm an optimist inside of all of this. Thank you for joining me. We'll have you back on Got Money again. Let's tee up another time for another 6 weeks. I can't wait to see how we're traveling. Take care, Nicki. All the best, and I hope you're well and safe.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Thanks, mate.